Good afternoon, Sec 1s. Now, yesterday you would have learnt about the heating curve, and the heating curve represents solids or liquids gaining heat, and when solids gain heat, they actually melt, and when liquids gain heat, they boil and they become water vapor or gas. So we have learned from solid, liquid to gas. Now today we're going to be learning about another type of curve, and this curve is known as the cooling curve. Now the cooling curve is the opposite of the heating curve. You would notice that the heating curve goes in the opposite direction. So a heating curve would go somewhat like that. Okay, and you know that a cooling curve seems to be going in the opposite direction. So for a heating curve, you're talking from solid, liquid to gases. Okay, and for a cooling curve, you are actually going to be talking in the opposite direction from gas to liquid to solid. So that's why it is cooling. So remember, when a substance actually cools, it actually undergoes the process known as contraction because it is losing heat. Okay? Alright, so now before we actually move on, I'll just like you to watch this simple animation. You can see that now my red dot is at the gas. So this area here represents the substance when it is in its gas state. Look at the molecules in which it is moving. The particles are very far apart. They are moving randomly, freely, and at very high speeds. Now when the gas cools, that means it condenses to become liquid. Notice that it is at this part of the curve now, so it's going downwards instead of going up the curve. Now when it goes downwards, you notice that the particles in your liquid, they are close together now. However, they are still moving randomly, okay, but they are sliding past each other. Then when the liquid cools, like for example, when you put tap water into a tray and put it inside the freezer and you allow the liquid to cool, it becomes ice. This is known as freezing. So now if you look carefully, when liquid freezes and becomes a solid, okay, in this picture over here, you can see that the arrangement and the movement of the particles actually change, okay, with time. So you can see that now the particles are vibrating about their fixed positions. They are not moving randomly. Look at the liquid again versus the solid. Okay, the particles are not sliding past each other. All right, and basically they are in a fixed position. Okay, so now I'd just like to play this animation for you to show you what is happening in a cooling curve. See, so it's going down, there is a change in state, and then it cools. The liquid is actually cooling. Now you can see that as the liquid is cooling, the particles are getting closer and closer to each other. Alright, then when the liquid freezes and becomes solid, this is your freezing. Okay, notice what happens. It becomes a solid and the particles are now arranged in a fixed position, vibrating about their positions and arranged very closely packed together. So this is what we're going to be learning about, the cooling curve. So the cooling curve actually focuses on two processes. Yesterday, Mr. Mong took you through melting and boiling. Now these two processes are found on the heating curve, but the cooling curve will be looking at freezing and condensing. Okay, so today we'll be looking at these two processes. Alright, so let's look at page 12 of your notes. The cooling curve basically shows you a graph, alright, where we are looking at the temperature change of a substance. Okay, the temperature change of a substance against time. So this temperature change is not an increase in temperature, which is your heating curve. This temperature change is basically a decrease in temperature, and that's why it's called your cooling curve. Now, something that you need to take note of is that the condensation point, okay, the condensation point in which the gas becomes a liquid, this flat part of the graph known as B, alright, is also the same as the boiling point. That means, for example, water boils at 100 degrees Celsius, but water vapor condenses also at 100 degrees Celsius. Okay, next thing, freezing point is also the same as the melting point. Alright, so for example, water freezes at 0 degrees Celsius, but at 0 degrees Celsius, your solid can also melt. Okay, and also take note that the condensation point and the boiling point is the same, and the freezing point and the melting point is the same, only in pure water. So you may want to take note of this. This only takes place in pure water. That means if water is contaminated, if you have water that is contaminated, let's say with salt, this will not be the case. Alright, and I think Mr. Mong stressed yesterday when we're talking about any change in state. Alright, so how do you know that there is a change in state? Which part of the graph shows you that there is a change in state? That means from solid liquid or to liquid gas, or from gas to liquid, or from liquid to solid. We will always look at the part of the graph that is flat. That means this part of the graph that is a straight line. These two actually represents a change in state. Okay, that is something that you will have to take note of. Alright, so let's continue. Now, at any point of time, if you want to pause the lecture, you can do so that you can take your time to fill in your notes. Now, the diagram that we're going to be looking at today in front of you on page 12 is actually the cooling curve of water. So let's identify the different states that we see at the different parts of the graph. So at A, you can see that we are starting out when the substance is actually gas. And the gas and the graph is going downwards. Why? Because the gas particles are actually losing heat. So your gas is actually cooling. So therefore, at A, we say that the substance is entirely gas because there is no change in state. Remember, a change in state is only when you have the flat line here. So therefore, at B, it will be a change in state from gas to liquid. Now, we are talking about the cooling curve of water, so it will definitely become liquid after gas. Okay, now at B, you will notice there is a mixture of states. Now, always remember that in a change of state, whenever a substance changes its state from either gas to liquid or from liquid to gas, that particular change in state will always have a mixture. So you may want to write this down. Alright, there will always be a mixture. There will be a mixture of states when there is a change. Okay, what do I mean by a mixture? That means this gas, okay, at the first part of the flat line is still gas. Now, as it slowly changes, it will then become liquid. Then it will slowly become fully liquid. So this part here is actually a mixture of gas to liquid, because your gas cannot miraculously all become liquid. It will take time. So as time passes on, it will then change from gas to liquid. Therefore, every change in state here will always be a mixture of states. Okay, so then what happens at the end of B? This will be fully liquid, and then liquid will start to lose heat, and that's why you can see the temperature is decreasing. So it will be fully liquid. Now at D, alright, you can remember what did Miss Lee say. At D, this part here is a flat line, so this represents a change in state. So therefore, a change in state, there will be a mixture of gases, and since we are talking about liquid to solid, D will be liquid and solid state as well. And after the freezing point, which is at D, okay, because freezing is from liquid to solid, E will be fully solid. So you can see that for your cooling curve, for cooling curve of water, alright, we are talking in the opposite direction from gas to liquid to solid. But if you're talking about a heating curve of water, then you're talking from solid to liquid to gas. So a cooling curve is actually going in the opposite direction as a heating curve. Okay, so that's one thing you would like to take note of. So I'm just going to summarize. Number one, okay, a cooling curve, we are always talking about in a reverse direction. Okay, so gas to liquid to solid. And then in a cooling curve, you must also remember, similar to a heating curve, any change in state, you need to take note of two things. Number one, there is a mixture of states because it takes time. Alright, it takes time to fully change state. Okay, secondly, in a change in state, there is no change in temperature. The temperature remains constant. Look at B, where there is the first change in state from gas to liquid. The second one, there is also no change in temperature. So a change in state means no change in temperature. Okay, so these are some of the things that you need to take note of. So you can pause the video here. If not, you can continue. Alright, so let's identify the different states of water. So A is gas, B is liquid and gas, C will be liquid, D will be solid and liquid, and E will be solid. Now let's identify the two processes that's involved in the cooling curve at both B and D. So B, from gas to liquid, good, is called condensation. Now we learn about condensation in simple distillation. Remember, when the water vapor passes through the condenser and then you get to collect your distillate, which is actually pure liquid, water vapor condenses, right, in a cooler environment. Then D is when your liquid loses heat and becomes solid, just like your liquid in your freezer becoming ice, and this is known as freezing. Okay, so this is how we interpret the cooling curve. Now let's move on. Now let's look at page 13 and look at question 2008 paper 4 question 3. Now let's analyze the question. A sample of solid stearic acid is heated above 90 degrees Celsius so that it melts. So that at 90 degrees Celsius, if we say it's heated above 90 degrees Celsius, at 90 degrees Celsius here, what can we say? We can say that this graph shows the results obtained when this molten stearic acid is a chemical, cools to 20 degrees Celsius. Now, what is something very important about this question? Please circle the word molten. Molten means it is in its liquid state. Alright, so that means at this 90 degrees temperature, we are talking about stearic acid existing as a liquid. Okay, so then it becomes quite easy. So let's first identify in which section of the graph, R, S, or T, is stearic acid completely solid. So if stearic acid starts at liquid, that means R is liquid. What do you think S will be? Since S will be a change in state, right? So liquid, the next change in state will be solid. So let's identify your R will be liquid. And remember, Miss Lee mentioned that if you have a flat line in the graph, that's a change in state. And a change in state means there is a mixture of states. So what is the state that is below liquid when it loses heat? That will be solid. So S will be a mixture of liquid and solid, and T will be purely solid. So the question is actually asking you which one in the graph R, S, or T is stearic acid completely solid. Your answer will be T. Now, what is the freezing point? So let's identify, this is not the condensation point, because condensation point is when R is a gas. But you know that R is not a gas because they say the graph actually shows molten. And molten means that it is existing in the liquid. That means the starting point is already liquid. So this has to be the freezing point. So what is the freezing point? Let's have a look at it. I'll make the graph a little bit bigger. So what you need to do is you need to use your ruler from this flat line. Draw a line that will go towards your left hand side like this. And you will notice that the value is 69 degrees Celsius. How do I know? Okay, if I draw this all the way, alright, it's actually at the point that is below 70, and this point is actually 68. Okay, how do you know? Because there are 5 squares in between, so every square has to be 2, 4, 68. That means this point is probably 68. Therefore, a line in between, okay, 68 and 70 will be 69 degrees Celsius. So therefore, the freezing point of stearic acid has to be 69 degrees Celsius. Okay, now these are some kind of common questions that will be asked during your WA3 and your end of the year. So it will be very good for you to clarify with your teacher the next time round if you still do not understand. If not, you can always rewatch this lecture. So let us move on. Okay, let's turn our attention now to page 13, looking at the second structured question. We say that a gaseous substance is allowed to cool. So obviously, if we say that we are starting off with a gaseous substance, that means between E to F, this part is going to be gas. So you would like to take note of that. Okay, then the temperature of the substance is taken at regular intervals, and you can see two flat lines in the graph. Now remember, if Miss Lee shows you two flat lines, that means this flat line and this flat line, this is the first change in state, and this is the second change in state. And since you are starting off with a gaseous substance, between E to F, this is gaseous state. Okay, this will be gas plus liquid, this will be liquid, this will be liquid and solid, and this will be solid. So this is how we usually interpret a cooling curve. Alright, so they ask you between which two letters on the time axis. So we turn our attention not to the temperature axis, but to the time axis. So we are looking over here on the horizontal axis. Is there only solid present? So where is your solid? Some of you may say, Miss Lee, is it here K and L because this is freezing? But remember, Miss Lee mentioned that at freezing, because it is a change in state, so if this is freezing, change in state will be liquid and solid, so it cannot be between K and L. Let's look at L and M. L and M will be fully solid because after the liquid has frozen, it will become a full solid. So therefore, your answer will be between L and M. So what is the process that is occurring at temperature F? Now we start with a gas. So what is the change in state from gas to liquid? Very good. Some of you are guessing the process is actually condensation. Okay, now condensation is when, alright, so this is your gas and this is your liquid. This is actually condensation, and in condensation there is a mixture of gas plus liquid. If we are talking about water, then this gas is known as water vapor. Alright, let's move on to the next question, which is found on page 14. So let's have a look. We say that the following graph shows the changes in temperature when a molten metal, now remember the word molten, calcium is allowed to solidify by cooling. That means calcium is starting off as a liquid because molten actually means liquid state. So you may want to write this in your notes. You can pause the video here to write. So that means that whenever we do this question, it will be very good for you to take short notes on your graph with a pencil so that you are able to interpret the question. So that means at P, we are looking at the liquid calcium. Okay, that means from P to Q, it is existing as a liquid. And you notice Q to R is a flat line. That means there is a change, okay, in state. And therefore, this will be liquid and solid because we say that it is allowed to solidify. That means we want to get liquid calcium to solid. Okay, and this is a process of change in state where there will be a change and therefore there will be a mixture, solid and liquid. Alright? So the first question they ask you, what is the freezing point of calcium? So let's have a look. Freezing point means we are talking about the graph that is a flat part because freezing is a change in state from liquid to solid. So we are looking at the straight line of the graph, which is between Q to R. Take your ruler, draw a straight line until it hits the temperature because they want you to find out the freezing point, and freezing point is the temperature. Okay, so we have already identified the various states, and therefore what is your freezing point? If you were to draw it all the way, okay, it will be 838 degrees Celsius. Okay, so now let us determine the different states of calcium at the different parts of the graph. From P to Q, we are starting out with liquid calcium, right? Because molten means liquid. So therefore, P to Q, your liquid is actually still cooling. It is not becoming solid yet because it hasn't reached the freezing point. So P to Q is liquid. Now Q to R, if you look at Q to R, okay, Q to R is a flat line, so there is a change in state. So there must be a mixture, liquid and solid. And therefore, R to solid is when your liquid has already completely solidified and calcium is now a solid metal. So it is now solid. Okay, I hope you have actually understood these questions. Alright, now this brings us to the end of our lecture for the cooling curve. Alright, now the most important thing that you need to remember about the cooling curve, which Miss Lee will now summarize for you, is that you must remember that it is always from gas to liquid to solid. So it's moving in the opposite direction of the heating curve. That's the first thing you must remember. Second thing, the cooling curve is when the substance is losing heat. Now, when the substance is losing heat, the particles are becoming closer together. Okay, that is why they become from gas to liquid to solid. The next thing, which is very similar to a heating curve, is that all your changes in state, okay, so any change in state, you must remember two things. Number one, no temperature change. So the temperature is constant. No increase or decrease. The second thing is that there will be a mixture of states because it takes time. Let's look at Q and R here. It takes time for the liquid to be fully converted into solid. So part of it, 50% will be liquid, solid, 30% liquid, 60% solid. So it will take some time for it to be fully solid. Now the fourth thing that you must remember about the cooling curve is we are not talking about melting or boiling. We are talking about condensation and freezing. Now, which part of the graph will be condensation or freezing? You must really look at the starting part. So if the starting part is liquid, then you can only talk about freezing. If the starting part is actually gas, then you have to talk about condensation to become liquid, and then from liquid freeze to become solid. So you really need to study the question in order for you to identify correctly the two processes in a cooling curve. Okay, Sec 1, so that brings me to the end of the lecture for the cooling curve. At any point in time, if you are not sure, please rewind to that particular position and re-listen to the lecture again. Now at this point, you will need to do two things for the remaining part of your science lesson. You will need to take out your textbook and look at questions 1, 3, and 8 and use the answers that are found on the Google site to mark your work. After that, you have to take a picture of your corrections and your marked work and send it to your teacher. The last thing that you have to do for today's lesson would be to turn to page 105 and 106 of your Theory Workbook A. Theory Workbook Volume A and complete Review Exercise 7. Okay, so the two things that you need to do now. Number one, go to the Google site under the answers for worksheets and workbook. Look at the answers for the textbooks, questions 1, 3, and 8 on page 138 to 139. Mark your work, complete your corrections, and then take a picture and send it to your teacher. Lastly, you will need to complete page 105 and 106 of your Theory Workbook Volume A, Review Exercise 7. You will also need to submit your completed work to your teacher. Thank you, and we will see you in the next lesson. Goodbye.